So I'm going to tell you some stories about mistakes I've made. And if you think back to where Dave started his talk, there was a framework for what researchers do. There was kind of 6 different circles. I'm going to talk about one of them, which hopefully emphasizes Dave's point that there is a lot to learn and a lot to keep leveling up. So we're going to spend 45 minutes on one circle, and we probably could spend a few hours. Is this working? OK. So Roy did this in the beginning, but I submitted my slides a few weeks ago, so I don't feel bad doing it again. For my reference and edification, how many of you are students? OK. How many of you are like in the first few years of your career? OK. How many of you are researchers? Designers? Oh, wow. Product managers? Engineers? In marketing? Something else? OK. So for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about today, if I say the word researcher, I'm talking about all of you. I'm talking about the person who's involved in research, regardless of whatever your title is. So please, for whatever reason, do not feel alienated by anything I'm about to say. But what I want to talk to you about is one of the biggest problems I see when people are starting off getting involved in research. This is something that Dave touched on briefly, something that I experienced for a long time before I realized what was going on. And it's actually a big problem that we're trying to address in various ways in the industry, especially at larger companies that have more formal mentorship programs. But I want to share with all of you what I messed up on, hopefully give you some guidance on how not to mess up on the same thing, and then talk about how to put these things into your practice. So, what's the problem? I would argue that many of us, all of us, want the work that we do to be valued and impactful, right? Who doesn't want to do valuable work? Right. One of the biggest problems that researchers face early in their career, especially for people transitioning from the academy, is they let that hunger for impact shape how they do the work. And they effectively create shortcuts in their process that makes their work fall flat. I'm going to tell you a quick story about how I experienced this. So in 2014, I was working at Facebook on the Pages mobile app. And it didn't look quite this nice or this useful, because we still had a lot of work to do. But we were really trying to help small business owners effectively manage their page. And we were realizing that there was a lot of low activity in the app. And so the product manager I was working with had tasked me with going and understanding what was wrong. That was like basically the request I got. And so I was like, cool, I'm going to bring in some local small business owners. I'm going to stick them in the lab. They're going to do things in the app. I'm going to see what's wrong, right? Bada bing, bada boom, research. So as people came in and I started speaking to them, no one had problems doing any of the tasks I asked them to do. They could navigate their way through the app fine. They were able to perform all the tasks. And I was starting to get a little bit concerned because I was like, wait, we're seeing this in data, but people are doing just fine. What's going on here? Then I got really lucky, and one of the people who came in remarked that he was really sorry for being late. And it was really difficult to be a small business owner and balance, in his case, running a coffee shop during the day, and then like stepping away from work to do this. And I was like, oh, that totally makes sense. And as he said this, I had like a flicker of a good idea. You know, like where you have that good idea and then it's gone and you're like, did I think that or not? Okay, I was like, oh, I'm not going to say anything to him. I'll just let this go. So we went on with the interview, and he started going through the tasks. And he, too, was totally fine. But at the end, he said something to me that was really helpful. He was saying, you know, I love the product. I think the Facebook Pages app is really great. But the hard thing for me when I'm running my coffee shop is I'm balancing, you know, helping customers, answering calls, and all this other stuff. And I don't get to Facebook till the end of the day when I can sit down on my computer. And honestly, the app just has too much friction. And at that point, I was like full light bulb. I was like, aha, this is what I'm doing wrong. So what I realized was that no one actually had problems with the mobile experience. And the problem that I was having as a researcher was the way I conducted the study. All the people I talked to knew exactly what to do, and they knew how to do it. The problem was that throughout their day, they didn't have the time to do it. They weren't in the right context to take any of these actions. And the study that I had designed, sticking people in a lab and giving them the space, sparkling water, air conditioning, whatever, to go through these flows, wasn't a helpful way to understand the problems that they were having in trying to manage their small business on Facebook. So while I was focused on gathering data like totally about how people use the app, what I needed to do was take a much broader view. And the guidance that I'd gotten from my product manager was effectively, are there any issues with the app? Which was sort of the study that I outlined. But what I should have been thinking about was this decision of how can we better support small business owners? And maybe if that's how I had scoped my project, I might have been able to capture some of the context to understand these broader issues that were resulting in the data that we saw. So I dug into this more with the next few participants. And in fact, I heard similar things. Oh, yeah, I never have any time to do this. Or the more common one, it's just too many clicks away. And so I realized that the study I had scoped was entirely about usability. But it wasn't that usability was a problem. And this mistake I've seen play over not only in my own career, but in the dozens of people that I mentored at Facebook, where we basically did exactly what we were asked. And doing exactly what we were asked was in fact the problem. I didn't stop to think about why I was being asked to do this work, or the kind of decisions that me and my team were trying to make to help these business owners. I was just told, hey, go watch this interaction, tell me where it fails, and so I did it. And then my work had no impact. So what I realized at that point, which sort of cemented over time, was that the most important question I needed to ask as a researcher was, in fact, what decision are we trying to make? What are we doing for our customers? And how can the work that I'm doing inform that process? So over time, this sort of built up for me. And it's resulted in a formula that I use now in a much more explicit way to scope research. And this is what I want to share with you. I want to walk through the kind of the formula in a high level. I'm going to walk through a few examples of how applying that was helpful. And then I'm going to share some ways that you can put this in your own practice. So here's where you can take the photo. Here's the formula. This is the highlight. But for me, scoping research comes down to this very straightforward formula. And it doesn't spell a word, and it's kind of an acronym, but it's fine. But what that means is you need to start with what decision are you trying to make? And everything that you're going to do in research is going to come from this. Because when you know the kind of decision that you're trying to make, you can then decide what kind of evidence you need to make that decision, right? So if you're trying to decide, do we ship a product or not ship it? Do we change the website IA or not? Is there a problem with this flow? All of those things dictate how you evaluate that decision. And once you know what kind of evidence you need, you can be very specific about the kind of data you're looking to gather. Who do you need to gather data from? What do you need to get from them? And all of this ultimately shapes the approach that you're going to use to solve this problem. Now, in the example I showed you with pages, I started here. I was like, hey, go see what's wrong. I was like, cool. Here's the app. What's wrong? That didn't work. I did the study fine. I gathered the data I wanted, and I built an approach that way. But that didn't inform the decision that we were trying to make, so my work was ultimately not impactful. Don't start here. How are we doing? Okay. This is more of a pause for me to drink water. It's a good speaker hack. Okay, so we've talked about how I scope research. I want to share a quick story about what that looks like, but I also need to calibrate a bit. I'm going to talk about a project called Conversion Lift. If you happen to read the Facebook design blog, you might have read about this a few years ago. But I'd love for you to raise your hand if you've worked in advertising. I imagine this is a very small amount of you. Okay. But I imagine more of you can raise your hand if you understand how experiments work. Huh? Okay. So Conversion Lift is essentially the process of applying experimental design to ads. So the goal is to set up experiments such that you can causally prove that ads drove a specific outcome. I'm getting a lot of blank stares. So let's imagine we're some representative population of researchers in Canada, and I randomly assign you into two groups, and you're randomly assigned left and right. So group A over here is not shown ads. You spend X dollars on things. Group B is shown ads. They spend Y dollars. Assuming all else is equal, the difference is because I showed you ads. That's like functionally what Conversion Lift is trying to prove. If we're going to make a more concrete example, let's imagine the team at Strive wanted to understand if we ran ads, would we get people to buy more tickets or spend more money? So again, group A, maybe we show ads to 500 people, 500 researchers in Canada, 200 of you spend $500 on tickets, so we made $100,000. Group B, 250 of you, so more of you, spent an average of $800 on tickets, so more money, $200,000. Assuming everything else is equal, that $100,000 can be attributed to ads. And this is what all of you are looking at me like right now. So this is where I was in 2015 when I was working on this. I was like, what just happened? What are we building? I don't understand what's going on. And this used to be a very human-intensive process at Facebook. So we had an entire team of economists and statisticians that actually worked with clients to help design and run these tests. And our job as a product team was to take that very white glove, very intensive service and make it a self-service product. And our response was, oh shit. But thankfully, I had some semblance of the framework that I showed you earlier, and I worked with my team to scope down and focus on the decisions that we were trying to make so that we could approach our work thoughtfully. And ultimately, we had two decisions that shaped everything we did. The first one was, in these lift tests and in this product, what are the most important metrics to show? And then the second decision, which came from that, was, okay, how do we show them in the right way? So when we were determining the right metrics, it was very clear that the decision we were trying to make was like, we have this product, we have a report, what are we going to put there? And so what we decided that the evidence would be for our decision was alignment with our customers on how they actually were going to use this data and what the success of their campaigns looked like. That made sense? So we decided that the data we wanted was actual feedback from customers on lift tests on how they determined success. So we were going to sit down with them and actually understand, hey, you recently ran this test. What did you look at? Why was that helpful? Was that informative for future action or just something that was nice to know? And in fact, we ended up doing a card sorting activity where every metric they wrote down, we put on an index card. And then we had them put it into a group of like, yes, this is absolutely critical. This is nice to have. And like, oh my God, please don't show me this because I don't want to see it. And there's like a probably illegible screenshot for many of you. So what we ended up with was basically metrics that pointed at these two things. And I sort of teased them for you earlier. Did more people buy? And did people buy more? And if I had a reasonable degree or understanding of economics, I probably could have given this to the team earlier, but I'm a researcher, so here we are. So then we had to figure out, okay, we have these metrics. How do we put this into a story that people can understand that doesn't require like the head of measurement science sitting next to you and walking through a report? And so we asked ourselves, how do we communicate and visualize these things for this broad audience? And what we decided that we needed was evidence not only that you could correctly understand what you were looking at, but that you would take the right action subsequently. And so you'd look at this metric and say, ah, yes, we increased spend in this way, cool, I know what to do after that. Because otherwise you're just spending a lot of money to learn something. And so the data we were looking for there was actual interpretations of these results and lightweight action plans of what would happen. And thankfully, we had a really great relationship at this point with the sales team. And so we were able to sit in again and again and again for most of our clients who were running these tests and just truly iterate our way through. And apologies that is so washed out, but you get the point. And so we did this for dozens of clients, where we would just come in, look at their results, give them a report, have them read it to us. We tried different reports, we tried different parts of reports, and ultimately, we were able to align on the final product. And what that looked like for us was three things. We had a card-based model where each card answered a core question for our clients. And answering each of those questions required two things. It required a natural, plain language statement that anyone in the organization could read, and a visual explanation of the math, which we dubbed math explanations. So here's at a high level what those cards would look like. You had this summary card way at the top, which said, hey, you ran this test. There was $500,000 in additional sales. Like, that was the number they wanted to know. And then that was composed of two separate things. Did more people buy, and did people buy more? And as you dug into each of those things, you had, in very plain English, shout out to my content strategy team, exactly what happened as we were doing this math. So the stats and the math people at our client were really happy because we explained what we were doing. Everyone else was happy because they could read it. The visual design team was happy because it looked beautiful and made sense. Everyone was happy all around. And here's an example of what that looks like as we got into more and more complex things. So I just told you a bunch of things about working on ads at Facebook, which is like obviously not the most sexy topic right now. But it has a purpose, which is having a structure and breaking down research in this kind of methodical way works. I don't care if you use my framework, but I do think that there is value in starting from that decision and working your way through. And so what I want to do for those of you who are interested, assuming that you've bought in on this, is think about how you can go through each of those steps and work with other researchers or stakeholders at your organizations and get to a place where you can clearly align on decisions. You can determine what evidence you need, you figure out that data, and you plan your approach so that your research ultimately has impact. And to be very clear, like this was one twist in a very long and winding journey of me making mistakes. If you want to hear about more of them, we can talk afterwards. But embrace that this is going to be a process, and all of your organizations, as Dave pointed out, have different appetites for research. So some of this is going to be more painful for some of you. The first thing I want you to remember, though, is that all research has a cost. And like, let's be very honest, you're a researcher, so it costs you time. It costs you energy to plan. It costs you money probably to pay participants, right? It costs you analyzing time. It costs you time to share things out. And importantly, it costs your participants and your stakeholders too, right? Research is not free. People don't just exist to use your product. So before you go down this path, or as you're going down these paths, think about what is the cost of your research. It's not zero. It's not zero for any of you. It's not zero for me. So think about when you're doing this work, are you adding value that is more than the cost? Okay, so now we're gonna go step by step. I'm assuming that you're all bought in and that making decisions is important. So the first thing to do, which sounds painfully straightforward, is to identify what decision you're trying to make. But in my time as a researcher, there's been plenty of times I've started on a project and my team wasn't aligned on what we're doing. So sometimes I'll just post in a group chat, hey, I was under the impression that we're doing this research for X reason. Yeah? And then we're like, oh no, I'm trying to do this other thing. I'm like, whoa, okay, let's align. Sometimes it's as simple as having the product manager or the group manager write it down. This is the decision we're trying to make. Your research is going to inform it. Cool. Sometimes it means that I need to get a workshop together where a bunch of us have different questions and perspectives, and we need to hone those in to the single thing that matters right now. Sometimes there's multiple decisions that we're trying to make. And I imagine many of you have experienced this as researchers, where you start getting into these really detailed recruits where you're looking for like a person who in the last 12 hours has done this one thing, and they also have this background, and they have this preference, and you're like, wait, what is going on here? That's probably because there's multiple things you're trying to account for. Recognize that. Separate those decisions out and build research approaches against each of them so that you can answer each decision independently and completely instead of half-baking each of your answers. Sometimes you have to prioritize between those things. And the first question you ask should be, hey, are there any dependencies, like the one that I pointed out? Sometimes it has to do with urgency. Maybe the result of one decision has a big cost that the other one doesn't. In Slack, we talk about these as one-way doors. So if you make this decision, if you move forward, you can't go back. Making those decisions is often more important up front because it shapes the rest of your project trajectory. And then finally thinking about, do these have the same splash zone? So if I were to make these two decisions, how many people are they going to impact? And then perhaps most importantly, can you and your team actually make this decision? And my favorite example of this is pricing. I get product managers coming to me all the time and saying, hey, I want to understand if our product is too expensive. And I'm like, hey, are you going to make it free? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay. Why are we spending time on this then? They're like, well, we're worried it's expensive. It's like, okay, is what you're trying to understand whether customers believe they're getting enough value from the product? Are we trying to understand the people who are paying for the product? And they're like, oh, yeah, okay. It's like, Good, that's a different decision. It's not, is our product too expensive? It's, do people understand why our product is expensive? Do people understand the value that we're getting? And those things are very similar, and they're very related, but they're very different types of research. Cool. So we've got the decision. Let's talk about evidence. One of the first things to do, and I think that we've heard some of this today, and I know we're going to hear about some of this tomorrow, but it's really important to know your history. How has your company and your team made decisions in the past? What kind of evidence do they find to be most persuasive? Sometimes that's totally wrong, and you need to fix that. But it's really helpful to know how your team thinks. Because I think a lot of times the best research comes back and it feels intuitive to those people. And you don't even have to beat them over the head with it, right? It's just like, oh, here's what we found. And they're like, of course, yes, yes, I knew that all along. And you're like, great, my job is done. I'm going to go work on another project. The other thing to do is be a good neighbor. Most of us, I think, fortunately, don't work alone. We often have partners in analytics, data science, other parts of the organization that have types of expertise that can help strengthen the evidence that we're making. Bring those people in. Get them involved in the process. Help them strengthen your work and strengthen theirs. And finally, protect your customers. Remember, nobody exists to use your product. People have lives. So make sure that the kind of evidence that your team is looking for is reasonable, rational, and ethical. I think I switched some of that, but while you're taking photos, I apologize. We get to data. One of the most important questions to ask is, do you need more than one type? Just like the decision, there could be multiple types of data that are important. You might need qualitative data, quantitative data, behavioral data, attitudinal data, sentiment data, data from immediate points in, like now, data over long periods of time, simulated data, in-context data. All of these things are important to think about as you're planning. Because then you have to ask yourself, can I even collect that data? Can I, as an individual, as a company, in the world, is this possible? And then, again, is it reasonable and ethical to do so? There's plenty of data I would like to have that, there's no way I could actually collect. So I have to move on and figure something else out. And then I like to ask myself, does somebody else have this data? Because I'm pretty lazy, and if someone else has it, I'm just going to use it. Why should I do all that work, right? I have other projects to work on. Research has a cost. I'm just going to borrow from them. And if no one has it, then I have to ask myself, can I collect it, or do I need help? And again, be a good neighbor. Bring other people into the process. So, assuming you've answered all these questions with your team, you're in a really good place. You now can say, what do you want to learn, and why does that matter? You know who you want to learn it from. You know how you want to learn it. And now you need to think about, how are you going to keep track of what you learn, both while you're learning it and afterwards. Thinking about, how are you going to make sense of what you learn, right? Are you doing open-ended qualitative coding? Are you doing survey analysis? You need some sort of plan, right? So you don't just get a dump of data and then you're sitting in a trash pile going, how do I get out of here? And ultimately, how are you going to make that learning accessible? Not just to you, your immediate team right now, but to other people in your company over time as your company grows and the product changes. I'm almost done, I promise. So what I hope you're taking away is that as you're thinking about research, the most important thing to do is to start with the decision that you're trying to make. And even more than that, ask why you are doing your research. This is where everything should come from, because this is where everything has to go back to. At our best, researchers are amplifiers of the customer voice. We enable our product teams, and we can help drive huge change in our organization. But this only works, this is only impactful if you know why you are doing your work. Thanks.